Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. Dunmore Hall had not always been quiet. There had been a time, and Mrs. Hammond could still feel the edges of it, the way one feels the warmth of a fire long after the embers have gone cold, when the house had breathed with the lives of many. There had been the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, the clatter of silver in the dining room, the low murmur of voices drifting down from the first-floor gallery, like smoke from a well-kept fire. There had been the piano in the drawing-room, its notes filling the great hall and travelling upward through the house, touching every room, every corner, every small, quiet place where a person might stand and listen and feel that they were part of something larger than themselves. That time had passed. It had passed slowly, the way light passes from a winter afternoon, not in a sudden extinguishing, but in a gradual, gentle withdrawal, shadow by shadow, until one looks up and finds that the room has been dim for some while, without one noticing precisely when the change occurred. The owners had gone, the staff had gone, the piano stood with its lid closed and its keys untouched beneath a length of cotton sheeting, and the only sound in the great drawing-room now was the soft swish of Mrs. Hammond's feather duster as she moved among the covered furniture, touching each shape with the practised familiarity of a woman who has known a place for 50 years. She was not a hurrying woman. She had never been a hurrying woman. Her mother had told her, long ago in the narrow kitchen, with its smell of boiled linen and beeswax, that a house like Dunmore Hall did not ask to be rushed. It asked to be attended to. There was a difference, her mother had said, between cleaning and attending, and Mrs. Hammond had understood the distinction without needing it explained further, because she had been born understanding it. Born in the small room at the top of the back stairs, born into the rhythms of a house that had been old when her mother came to it, and would be older still when both of them were gone. The pale winter light came through the tall windows in long, slanted columns, and in those columns the dust moved. It drifted and settled and drifted again, unhurried, without purpose or destination, and Mrs. Hammond found it restful to watch. The dust had always moved this way. It would move this way long after she was done watching. There was something comforting in that continuity, in the knowledge that the dust of Dunmore Hall was older than she was, and would outlast her, that the particles of this particular air had travelled through these particular rooms for longer than anyone alive could account for. She paused before the marble fireplace and laid one hand against its cold surface. The marble was pale grey, veined with white, and beneath her palm it was smooth and absolutely still, the way stone is still, not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of deep patience. The fireplace had not held a fire in 11 years. She remembered the last one, a small, apologetic thing, lit by the solicitor's clerk, who had come to take an inventory of the contents before the estate passed fully into its present state of suspension, neither sold nor inhabited. simply kept as estates sometimes are when the inheritors cannot agree, and the lawyers find it easier to maintain the status quo than to resolve it. The clerk had lit the fire because the room was cold, and because he had seemed embarrassed by the emptiness of the house, by the silence of it, and Mrs. Hammond had stood in the doorway and watched the small flames, and thought that the fireplace deserved better than an apologetic fire. She moved on. The house breathed its patient breath around her. The clock in the great hall was her first obligation each day. It stood at the foot of the main staircase, tall and dark-wooded, its face a pale moon in the dimness of the hall. Its tick, the single most constant sound in a house that had otherwise fallen silent. She wound it on Wednesdays. It was Thursday, so it had been wound yesterday, and would not need winding again until next week. But she paused before it nonetheless, as she always did, and listened to its slow, steady rhythm. The clock ticked its slow, steady rhythm, unhurried, meticulous, indifferent to the absence of the house's former inhabitants. It kept time for no one and everyone. It kept time because it was its nature to do so, and Mrs. Hammond respected that quality in a mechanism. She respected it in a person, too. Her rounds were well established. She had pared them down over the years as the rooms were closed one by one. First the east wing, when the roof had developed a slow leak that no one had authorized funds to repair. Then the upper guest rooms, when the damp had crept under the window frames. Then the billiard room and the morning room and the small parlour that had once been used for cards. What remained open was what she could reasonably maintain alone: the great drawing room, the entrance hall, the dining room, with its long table still dressed in its linen. She laundered it herself by hand in the kitchen sink, and dried it in the corridor because the old airing cupboard had been mothballed. The kitchen and its attached scullery, and her own small room at the back of the house where the servants had once been quartered. There was also the small library. She had not entered the small library in some months. She was not superstitious. She did not believe in presences or impressions or the thin places that some people claim to feel in old houses. She believed in woodworm and damp, and the particular way that afternoon light moved across a polished floor. And she believed in the weight of memory, which was not supernatural, but simply the ordinary accumulated gravity of a life lived in one place for a very long time. The small library had a great deal of that weight. Her mother had liked to sit there in the window seat with its worn velvet cushion and read in the afternoons when her duties allowed, which had not been often, but had been often enough to make the habit a memory. After her mother had died, quietly in her sleep in the small room upstairs, Mrs. Hammond had found herself reluctant to enter the library, not unwilling exactly, simply reluctant, the way one is reluctant to disturb a room where something peaceful has recently ended. But today, she had noticed, passing the door on her way to check the corridor window for draughts, that the handle was cold, in a way that suggested the room had not been aired in too long, and so she had promised herself she would go in before the afternoon light failed. She gathered her duster and her small camwork cloth and the tin of beeswax polish she carried in the pocket of her apron, and she went to the door of the small library and put her hand on the handle and turned it. And the door opened with its familiar complaint, a low creak that she had been meaning to oil for years, and had never quite got round to, and she stepped inside. The room was as she had left it. The shelves held their rows of leather, bound volumes, their spines faded to shades of ochre and burgundy, and the particular grey-green of old vellum. The leather wing-back chair stood beside the cold fireplace with its back to the window, as it always had. The small writing desk against the far wall held nothing. She had cleared it years ago, the papers inside disposed of with the solicitor's permission, its surface empty and slightly dusty beneath the window's pale illumination. The dust settled in the fading light, slow and indifferent, and Mrs. Hammond stood a moment at the threshold and breathed the room's air, which smelled of old paper and dry wood, and faintly of something she could not quite name. Something warm, something like cedar, something almost floral, though she could not account for it. She began to dust the shelves, working methodically from left to right, top to bottom, the way her mother had taught her. Left to right, top to bottom. Start at one end and finish at the other, and do not go back, because going back means you miss something the first time. And a thing worth doing is worth doing so that it does not need doing again. She worked her way along the shelves, her duster whispering over the spines of the books, and she was nearly at the window when she saw it, on the windowsill. She knew that windowsill. She knew it the way she knew every surface in this house, with the certain knowledge of a woman who has dusted a thing 2,000 times and can account for its emptiness as precisely as she can account for anything placed upon it. The windowsill of the small library was empty. It had been empty the last time she was here. It had been empty, to her knowledge, for years. It was not empty now. A small journal lay there, its cover of dark leather worn soft with age, the corners rounded where many hands had held it. It was tied with a ribbon, faded green, the colour of old leaves, the colour of the velvet on the window seat when the velvet had been new. Beside the journal, placed with a deliberateness that was immediately apparent, lay a single dried rose. The petals had contracted inward with age curling at their edges, but they held still a deep dark crimson, not quite red, not quite brown, something between the two that was its own particular colour and nothing else. Mrs. Hammond stood very still for a moment. The dust settled in the fading light. The clock ticked its slow, steady rhythm distantly through the closed door of the library. The house breathed its patient breath. She reached out and picked up the journal, and the leather was soft beneath her fingers, as soft as the worn places on her own gloves. And it was warmer than it ought to have been, given the cool of the unheated room, though she did not allow herself to think too long about the warmth of it. She held it a moment, and then she untied the ribbon, her fingers working carefully at the bow, which had been tied loosely enough to undo without difficulty, as though it had been tied by someone who expected it to be untied. She laid the ribbon on the window-sill beside the rose. She opened the journal. The pages were old. She could see that in the yellowing at their edges, the slight brittleness when she turned them, the faint browning of the ink that had once been black and was now the colour of dried tea. The handwriting was small and regular, a script she had not seen in many years, but recognized at once, with the absolute certainty of a person who has read a hand their whole life and carries it in their body the way they carry the memory of a voice. Her mother's handwriting, Mrs. Hammond, sat down on the window seat. She did not remember choosing to sit. She was simply sitting, the journal open in her lap, the pale winter light coming through the glass above her and falling across the open pages. And she was looking at her mother's handwriting, small and regular and utterly familiar, and she was reading. She kept the house alive when no one else would. She turned the page. She kept the house alive when no one else would. And the next. She kept the house alive when no one else would. Every page, the same sentence in her mother's hand, repeated with the patient steadiness of a woman who had decided that something mattered, and was going to continue saying it until she had said it enough times to make it permanent. Page after page, the same words, the same hand, the same small regular script that Mrs. Hammond had watched her mother use to write shopping lists and household accounts, and the occasional letter to a distant relative in Yorkshire who had never written back. She kept the house alive when no one else would. She sat for a long time with the journal open in her lap. The silence was a soft blanket around her. The dust settled in the fading light. Outside the window, the winter afternoon was drawing in, the sky beyond the bare elms turning from pale grey to the particular grey. White that precedes dusk, and Mrs. Hammond sat in the window seat where her mother had sat to read in the quiet afternoons. And she held the journal, and she let the words settle into her. She thought of her mother, Eleanor Hammond. She had taken the surname when she married, had kept it when he left, had brought it to Dunmore Hall when she came to work there. A young woman with dark hair and a straight back and hands that already knew how to work. She had come to the hall the year Mrs. Hammond was born, had brought the infant with her because there was nowhere else for an infant to go, had raised her daughter in the small rooms at the back of the house, while managing the linen, the accounts, the training of the younger staff, the 1,000 small and necessary things that kept a house of Dunmore Hall's scale running with the appearance of effortlessness that its owners expected and its staff understood to be the product of continuous, invisible labour. Mrs. Hammond thought of her mother's hands. They had been capable hands, neither delicate nor coarse, with short, clean nails, and the slight redness about the knuckles that came from years of cold water and good soap. They had been hands that knew where everything was, that could locate in the dark the precise shelf in the linen cupboard where the guest towels were kept, that could assess the silver's condition with a glance, that could feel the slight give in a floorboard before anyone stepped on it, and know that the board would need attending before it gave way entirely. They were hands that had, among everything else they did, taught Mrs. Hammond to do all of it, to fold a sheet so that the fold lay precisely at the bed's edge, to polish the silver in small circles and buff it with a clean cloth, to notice when a room's air was stale and know how long to open the window to correct it without chilling the room unduly. Her mother had said very little about the work directly. She had simply done it, and Mrs. Hammond had watched. And the knowledge had passed between them the way knowledge does in houses like Dunmore Hall, not through instruction but through presence, through the daily repetition of actions that gradually became habitual and then essential and finally indistinguishable from the self. Mrs. Hammond could not now separate what she knew of Dunmore Hall from what she knew of her mother, because the two had always been the same knowledge, held in the same body, carried in the same careful hands. She had not known her mother was watching her so closely. She had assumed, in the way that children assume and then adults forget to examine, that her mother saw what needed doing and did it and did not keep a record, that the work was its own acknowledgement, that the keeping of a house was self-evident in the result, in the polished floors, the aired rooms, the beds that stayed made, and the clocks that kept winding, and that no one kept account of the keeper herself. She had thought of her own labour in the same way. After her mother died, and the staff dwindled away one by one and the owners stopped coming, and the solicitors' letters became less frequent and eventually ceased, she had thought of it as simply what was done, as the continuation of a thing that had always been continued, as faithful in the way that a clock is faithful, because it was its nature, and it knew no other. She had not thought of being seen, the journal said. She kept the house alive when no one else would. Her mother had written this over many years. Mrs. Hammond could see that in the variations of the ink, some pages blacker, some browner, the pen pressed differently at different times, the hand slightly looser on some pages. She had written it at intervals, returning to the journal again and again over what must have been a span of years, filling its pages with the single sentence as though it were a prayer, or a record, or a private form of witness that required no audience because it was sufficient in itself. She kept the house alive when no one else would. Mrs. Hammond thought she knew. Her mother had watched her daughter take up the work, had watched the staff leave one by one, had watched the rooms close, and the furniture shroud itself in cotton, and the chandelier crystals lose their brilliance to a slow accretion of dust that no one else noticed, because no one else looked at chandeliers any more. Her mother had watched all of it, and had said nothing, because Eleanor Hammond was not a woman who said things when they could be recorded. Instead, when they could be made permanent, when they could outlast the saying, she had written the sentence that could not be said, that felt too large for speech, that would have embarrassed both of them in the saying, that needed the privacy of a page and a ribbon, and a place kept safe until the right moment to be found. Mrs. Hammond sat with the journal in her lap, and the dried rose beside her, and the pale winter light fading over the bare elms. And she thought about the right moment. She thought about her mother placing the journal on the window-sill, or perhaps it had been there for years, placed before she died, or perhaps someone else had placed it. But no, she did not allow herself that thought, because there was no one else. There had not been anyone else here in a very long time. And the more she sat with the impossibility of its presence, the more she understood that the impossibility was the point, that the journal was not something to be explained, but something to be received, that it had been placed in the only room she had been avoiding, on the only sill she would not have checked if she had not noticed the cold of the door handle and made herself go in, that it had been waiting for the morning she was ready to go in. She closed the journal, she tied the ribbon, she held the small bundle in both hands, and sat in the window seat in the fading light, and let the silence be what it was. The silence was a soft blanket. The house breathed its patient breath. The dust settled in the fading light. She did not cry. She had not expected to cry, and she did not. She was not a woman who cried easily, not because she lacked feeling, but because her feeling ran deep and still, the way deep rivers run, without the turbulence that announces itself at the surface. What she felt was something quieter than grief and larger than gratitude. It was a settling. She was a woman who had spent her life attending to settling, the settling of dust, the settling of a house into its foundations, the settling of evening into its long dark hours. And she recognized the feeling now as a kind of inward settling, a thing that had been waiting to rest, finally resting. In 50 years of quiet work, in the decades of faithful, unwitnessed service, she had been seen by the one person whose seeing mattered to her, and the seeing had been recorded, and the record had been kept, and now it was hers. She thought of all the years she had worked in this house without anyone to notice. The solicitor communicated by letter. The inheritors, distant cousins of the original family, people she had never met, occasionally sent a brief note approving her continued employment and the continuation of the small maintenance fund that covered her wages and the most essential repairs. The postman came twice a week. The village was 3 miles, and she went in on Fridays for provisions. She was not lonely precisely. She had the house, and the house was company of a particular kind, company she understood and valued. But there was a difference between the company of a house and the company of a person, and she had not had the latter in a very long time. Her mother had understood that her daughter would stay when everyone else went, not out of obligation or lack of alternatives, but out of the same deep still quality that had kept Eleanor Hammond herself in service, long past the point when she might have left, the same quality that made a person wind a clock for 50 years, because the clock needed winding and someone had to do it. Her mother had understood and had written it down, and the writing of it had been an act of love as exact and practical as the folding of a sheet. She kept the house alive when no one else would. Mrs. Hammond rose from the window seat, the journal in one hand, the dried rose carried carefully in the other, its fragile petals undisturbed by her careful fingers. She took one last look at the window-sill, bare now, and somehow not quite as empty as it had been before, as though the act of placing and the act of finding had left something there, some quality in the air, some residue of the afternoon's reckoning. Then she turned and carried the journal and the rose out of the small library, pulling the door closed behind her with its familiar complaint. She put the journal on the small shelf above her bed, beside her mother's photograph. The photograph had been there for 11 years. A small square print in a plain wooden frame, her mother in the doorway of the kitchen, turned slightly as though she had been caught in the act of turning away, her hair pinned back, her apron straight, her expression caught between attention and the beginnings of a smile. Mrs. Hammond had looked at this photograph every morning for 11 years and every night before she extinguished her lamp, and she would continue to look at it for however many mornings and nights remained to her. But now she placed the journal beside it, the two objects together on the narrow shelf, and the shelf seemed the right place for both of them, and the room seemed complete in a way it had not been complete before. The dried rose she placed in a small glass on her window-sill. The glass was plain, no wider than her fist, and she filled it with a little water, even though the rose needed no water, because it seemed right to tend to a thing, even a thing that had already finished its living. The crimson petals, deep and dark in the fading light, held their colour against the pale grey sky beyond the glass. And she thought that in the morning, when the light came through the east, facing window of her small room, the rose would catch it in a way she would be glad to see. She would add nothing to the journal's pages. She had considered it briefly, considered whether there was something she wanted to write in the blank pages that remained, whether there was a sentence she wanted to record in her own hand beside her mother's. But she had set the thought aside. The words her mother had written were enough. They were more than enough. They were precisely enough. To add to them would be to misunderstand their nature, which was not invitation but completion, not a beginning but the final word in a conversation that had been conducted over decades in the language of attending to things and keeping them as they ought to be kept. The journal would remain on the shelf. The rose would stand in its glass on the window-sill. No one would know of either. Mrs. Hammond had no intention of telling anyone, not because she was ashamed. There was nothing in her life that required concealment, but because some things are their own closure, their own sufficient world, and to speak of them is to dilute them. The journal was between herself and her mother. It had always been between herself and her mother. It would remain so. The winter light faded. The shadows lengthened in the great hall, gathering first in the corners and then spreading gradually across the floor, until the hall was dim and the clock at the foot of the staircase was a shape in the darkness rather than a visible thing, though its ticking continued undimmed, patient and exact, marking the quarter, ours with a single soft chime that had rung in this hall for longer than Mrs. Hammond had been alive. She completed her rounds. She checked the corridor windows and found them sound. She turned the handle of the east wing door and confirmed, as she did each evening, that the padlock on the other side was in place, though she could feel its resistance through the wood without actually checking it, because she had been checking it for so long that the feel of resistance was indistinguishable from the fact. She walked through the dining room and straightened the linen, which had not moved, but which she straightened anyway, because straightening it was part of the round, and the round was not complete without it. She checked the kitchen and turned off the small oil lamp she kept burning there for warmth, and she stood a moment in the dark kitchen with its smell of beeswax and cold iron and the faint ghost of everything that had ever been cooked in it, and she breathed it in, and then she was done. The entrance hall had one lamp, a small electric thing she had had. The electrician installed 3 years ago when the last of the old gas fittings finally gave out. She left it burning each night. A small single light against the darkness of the hall, visible through the glass panels on either side of the great front door, a signal to no one but necessary for reasons she had never articulated. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was the same instinct that made her wind the clock and straighten the linen, the instinct to leave a thing as it ought to be, in the state appropriate to what it was. Dunmore Hall ought to have a light burning in its entrance. Therefore it had one. The house breathed its patient breath around her as she climbed the narrow back stairs to her room. The stair creaked in the familiar places, 3rd step, 7th step. The small landing where the step had always been slightly uneven, and had been slightly uneven for as long as anyone could remember. She carried her hand along the wall as she climbed, feeling the smooth plaster beneath her palm, the slight coolness of it, and she thought of all the times she had climbed these stairs, 50 years of mornings and evenings, the innumerable daily ascents and descents that had worn a slight groove in the 3rd step, a slight groove in the 7th, a slight smoothness in the plaster, at the point where every person who had ever climbed these stairs had laid their hand. She thought of her mother climbing these same stairs. She thought of the other staff, the ones who had come and gone before her time, the ones she had known briefly in childhood, the ones she had watched leave one by one in her adulthood. She reached her room and went in. The journal was on the shelf. Her mother's photograph was beside it. The dried rose stood in its small glass on the window-sill, and outside the window the sky was the deep, still grey of a winter evening closing toward night, and the bare elms were silhouettes, and the grounds of Dunmore Hall stretched away into the darkness beyond the garden. The ha, and the kitchen garden, and the long grass of the south lawn where croquet had once been played on summer afternoons, all of it lying quiet now under the darkening sky, patient as stone, patient as the marble fireplace with its cold-veined surface, patient as the clock with its slow, steady tick. She undressed slowly, by lamplight, folding her clothes as she removed them, placing them over the back of the chair. She put on her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the shelf for a moment, at the journal and the photograph, and the quiet space between them where the lamplight rested. And then she extinguished the lamp and lay down. The darkness was complete and comfortable. The clock ticked its slow, steady rhythm through the walls of the house. The house breathed its patient breath around her, old and settled, its walls full of memory, its floors worn with 50 years of her particular footsteps, its clocks wound by her particular hands. The dust settled in the darkness, unhurried, without destination, the same dust that had moved through these rooms for 150 years, and would continue to move long after the last lamp was extinguished and the last clock unwound. She slept. In her sleep, Dunmore Hall arranged itself around her with the ease of long habit. The drawing-room held its shrouded furniture, the chandelier above it still and unlit but beautiful in the way that beautiful things remain beautiful, even in darkness. The piano in the corner did not play, but the memory of its music was present in the air, a thing sensed rather than heard, the way an absence can carry the echo of what it is the absence of. The great clock in the hall ticked on measured and faithful, and the single lamp in the entrance burned its small steady light, and the library stood with its empty window-sill and its shelves of faded volumes, and the faint warm scent that might have been cedar, or might have been something else entirely, something particular to that room on that afternoon, something that would not have a name in any language Mrs. Hammond knew, but that she would carry in her body for the rest of her days. The house dreamed of its quiet life, of fires that had burned in its fireplaces, and the people who had sat before them, of the piano played, and the voices lifted, and the carriages on the gravel, and the long, full evenings when every room had been lit, and the windows had glowed against the darkness, like something living. And then the house dreamed of the long years after, of the rooms closed one by one, the furniture covered, the staff departed, the silence deepening like water into a still pool, and through all of it a single figure moving with the slow, familiar grace of a lifetime, touching each surface with the certainty of a person who knows a place by heart, winding the clock and straightening the linen and carrying the feather duster through the pale winter light, with the patience of someone who understands that attending to things is its own form of love. Mrs. Hammond dreamed too, and in her dream her mother sat in the window seat of the small library, the green ribbon of the journal loose in her hands, the light around her the gentle light of a summer afternoon rather than a winter one, warm and yellow and full of the sound of the grounds in season, birdsong and the distant shear of the gardener's tools, when there had been gardeners. Her mother was reading, or she had been reading, or she was about to read. It was the way of dreams that the precise moment was impossible to fix. But she looked up from whatever she was doing, and she looked at her daughter, and she smiled. Not the beginning of a smile, not the caught gesture of the photograph on the shelf, but a full and deliberate smile, the kind that takes its time and means to be seen, and is sufficient in itself, requiring no words, no explanation, no addition of any kind. The kind of smile that says, "I saw you, I always saw you." Outside the windows of Dunmore Hall, the winter night deepened and settled, and became what winter nights become when the cold is complete and the stars are clear and the world has grown very still. The grounds lay quiet under the dark sky, the elms bare and patient, the grass of the south lawn silver, grey in the starlight. The house rose from its grounds as it had always risen, large and still and full of all its years, full of everything it had held and everything it held still, its walls keeping their memories the way walls keep warmth, slowly, with the whole mass of themselves releasing it gradually into the night. The clock ticked its slow, steady rhythm in the great hall. The lamp burned in the entrance, a small and faithful light. And upstairs, in the small room at the back of the house, the keeper of Dunmore Hall slept, and the house kept her in return, and the journal rested on its shelf, and the rose stood in its glass, and the silence was a soft blanket over all of it, over the faded grandeur and the worn carpets and the dusty chandelier and the cold marble and the shrouded piano and the empty rooms, and the house and its keeper breathed their patient breath together in the long, still dark, and Dunmore Hall dreamed its quiet life, and Mrs. Hammond dreamed with it, and everything was at rest, and everything was kept, and the night moved gently toward its morning.